The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a middle-aged American wearing a red baseball cap and a t-shirt with bold political slogans. He had traveled from Texas specifically to visit England. Those reasons weren't entirely about sightseeing. Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording a video for his social media followers back home. "Here I am at Windsor Castle, folks," he announced loudly, drawing curious glances from nearby tourists. About to witness some of that famous British pomp and circumstance everyone talks about. His voice carried a tone that suggested he wasn't entirely impressed by what he was seeing. The other visitors around him represented a diverse mix of nationalities. There was the Yamamoto family from Tokyo, carefully studying their guidebook. And taking respectful photos, an elderly German couple, Klaus and Ingrid, stood quietly observing the magnificent architecture. A group of French students chatted softly among themselves, clearly excited about the upcoming ceremony. Everyone seemed to understand they were in a place of historical significance and cultural importance. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus grew increasingly restless. He had expected something more dramatic, more entertaining. It's a formal atmosphere. And quiet reverence of the other tourists frustrated him. He was used to louder, more boisterous events back home, and this felt stuffy and pretentious to his way of thinking. "This is taking forever," he complained to anyone within earshot. A British mother with 2 young children politely asked him to lower his voice, explaining that her children were trying to learn about their country's traditions. Marcus rolled his eyes and muttered something about political correctness gone mad. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 20 minutes, and the crowd continued to grow. Palace staff moved efficiently through the area, ensuring everyone was positioned safely and could see the proceedings. The atmosphere was one of anticipation and respect, with people from around the world coming together to witness this centuries-old tradition. Marcus noticed how seriously everyone was taking the event. Children stood quietly beside their parents. Elderly visitors leaned forward eagerly, despite their tired legs. And even teenagers had put away their phones to focus on what was about to unfold. This only served to annoy him further. He felt like he was surrounded by people who were taking themselves too seriously. A palace guide began, explaining the history and significance of the ceremony to a small group nearby. She spoke about the tradition dating back centuries, the dedication of the guards, and the importance of the ceremony in British culture. Marcus listened for a moment, but found himself disagreeing with much of what he heard. In his mind, all this tradition and ceremony represented exactly what his political beliefs stood against. The guide mentioned how the royal family had served Britain for generations, adapting to changing times while maintaining important traditions. She spoke with genuine pride about the institution and its role in British society. Several tourists asked thoughtful questions about the history and meaning behind various aspects of the ceremony. Marcus felt compelled to interject. "That's all well and good," he called out, interrupting the guide mid-sentence. "But where I come from, we don't bow down to anybody. We believe in real leadership, not this outdated stuff." The guide looked startled, and several tourists turned to stare at him with disapproving expressions. An elderly British gentleman approached Marcus politely. "I say, old chap," he began gently, "perhaps we could discuss this after the ceremony. Many of us have traveled quite far to see this." The man's tone was diplomatic, clearly trying to avoid confrontation while maintaining the peaceful atmosphere. Marcus wasn't interested in diplomacy. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble," he replied, though his voice suggested otherwise. "But I think people should hear a different perspective. You've got real leaders in the world today who actually get things done, instead of just waving from balconies and cutting ribbons." The tension in the crowd was becoming noticeable. Parents pulled their children closer, and several tourists began moving to different positions to avoid the brewing conflict. The palace staff noticed the disturbance and began making their way through the crowd toward the source of the commotion, as the first notes of military music began to drift across the courtyard. Signaling the imminent start of the ceremony, Marcus felt a surge of determination. He had something to say, and he wasn't going to let British politeness or centuries of tradition stop him from expressing his views. After all, he reasoned, wasn't free speech one of the things his country had taught the world about? The stage was set for what would become a confrontation that none of the tourists present would ever forget. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had witnessed many dramatic moments throughout history, but few as unexpected as what was about to unfold. On this seemingly ordinary morning, the sound of military boots echoed across the ancient stones as the ceremony officially began. The royal guards emerged in their distinctive red tunics and tall bearskin hats, moving with precision that spoke of countless hours of practice and dedication. Their movements were synchronized perfectly, each step deliberate and purposeful. The crowd fell silent, captivated by the display of discipline and tradition. Marcus watched the guards with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He had to admit, they looked impressive, but in his mind, this was all for show. Real strength, he believed, came from bold leadership and decisive action, not from marching around in fancy uniforms. He continued recording on his phone, occasionally making commentary that earned him sharp looks from nearby tourists. The ceremony progressed with its time-honored rituals. Commands were given in crisp military tones, and the guards responded. With flawless execution, tourists snapped photos respectfully, careful not to interfere with the proceedings. The atmosphere was reverent, almost sacred, as people witnessed traditions that had been maintained for generations. During a particularly quiet moment in the ceremony, Marcus decided he had seen enough. His patience with what he perceived as meaningless pageantry had run out completely. "You know what?" he announced loudly, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "This is exactly what's wrong with the world today. All this bowing and scraping to people who were just born lucky." Several tourists turned to shush him, but Marcus was just getting started. "I mean, look at them," he continued, gesturing toward the ceremony. "Grown men playing dress-up and pretending it means something. Where I come from, we respect people who actually earn their position through hard work and results." A Japanese tourist tried to reason with him quietly. "Please, sir, many people have come very far to see this. Could you perhaps wait until after?" His English was careful but clear. His tone was respectful despite his obvious frustration with the disruption. Marcus turned to face him directly. "That's exactly the problem with the world today, buddy. Too much politeness, not enough truth-telling. Someone needs to point out that the emperor has no clothes, if you know what I mean." His voice had risen even higher, and now most of the crowd was paying attention to him rather than the ceremony. The palace staff had been watching the situation develop. Several guards stationed around the perimeter had noticed the disturbance. However, they remained at their posts, professional and disciplined despite the obvious disruption to the ceremony they were sworn to protect. Marcus pulled out his phone again and began recording another video. "Folks back home, you're seeing this live from Windsor Castle, where I'm watching what might be the most expensive costume party in the world. These people are treating these guards like they're some kind of heroes, but what have they actually done? They march around, they stand still, they follow orders from people who inherited their jobs." An elderly British woman approached him, her voice trembling with emotion. "Young man, my grandfather served in these guards during the war. He fought for this country and everything it represents. How dare you mock something you clearly don't understand?" Marcus looked at her with what he thought was sympathy, but came across as condescension. "Ma'am, I'm not disrespecting your grandfather, or any real soldiers. I'm just saying we shouldn't confuse ceremony with substance. The world has real problems that need real solutions, not more parades and pretty uniforms." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but before she could respond, Marcus continued his rant. "Look, I get it. Tradition is nice and all, but at some point, you have to ask whether all this pomp and circumstance is actually helping anybody. Meanwhile, there are leaders in the world today who are actually making a difference, actually solving problems, actually putting their countries first." By now, his voice had become so loud that it was interfering with the ceremony itself. The guards continued their duties with professional stoicism, but it was clear that the disruption was affecting the experience for everyone present. Children were asking their parents what the angry man was talking about, and several tour groups had moved away from the area entirely. Marcus felt emboldened by the attention he was receiving. In his mind, he was speaking truth to power, standing up for common sense against centuries of inherited privilege and unearned authority. He began to pace back and forth, gesturing dramatically as he spoke. "You want to know what real leadership looks like?" He called out to the crowd. "It's not about being born into the right family or wearing the right uniform. It's about results. No matter putting your people first, no matter what the establishment thinks. It's about having the courage to shake things up when the old ways aren't working anymore." The ceremony continued despite his outburst, but the magic of the moment had been broken for many of the tourists. What should have been a peaceful, memorable experience was being overshadowed by one man's determination to make his political point at the expense of everyone else's enjoyment. As Marcus prepared to escalate his protest even further, he remained completely unaware that his behavior had been noticed by someone who took the dignity of the royal family and the honor of the ceremony very seriously indeed. The confrontation he had been building toward was about to arrive in a way he never could have anticipated. Standing among the ceremonial guards was Sergeant James Mitchell, a man whose 23 years of service had taken him from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the ceremonial duties at Windsor Castle. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from genuine military experience. His imposing 6'3" frame was perfectly fitted in the traditional red tunic. But beneath the ceremonial uniform beat the heart of a soldier who had seen real combat and understood the true meaning of duty and honor. Sergeant Mitchell had been watching Marcus's outburst with growing concern. As a professional soldier, he was trained to maintain composure under all circumstances. But he was also deeply committed to protecting the dignity of the institution he served. Every word that came from Marcus's mouth felt like a personal insult, not just to the royal family, but to every man and woman who had served Britain with honor. The sergeant's military service record was distinguished. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, where he had earned commendations for bravery under fire and leadership in impossible situations. He had seen friends wounded and killed defending the very freedoms that allowed people like Marcus to speak their minds without fear of persecution. The irony was not lost on him that someone was using those hard-won freedoms to mock the sacrifices made to secure them. During his time in combat zones, Sergeant Mitchell had worked alongside American soldiers and had developed deep respect for their professionalism and courage. He understood that Marcus's behavior was not representative of Americans as a whole, but rather the actions of one individual who seemed to have forgotten the basic principles of respect and courtesy that decent people showed to others. As Marcus's voice grew louder and his gestures more dramatic, the sergeant noticed the effect it was having on the tourists around him. A small girl was clinging to her mother's leg, frightened by the angry man's shouting. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair, who had likely come to honor traditions he had once served to protect, looked deeply saddened by the spectacle. Several international visitors appeared confused and uncomfortable, unsure how to respond to such behavior in what they had expected to be a respectful, ceremonial environment. The sergeant's training had taught him to assess situations quickly and respond appropriately. He could see that the palace staff were trying to handle the situation diplomatically, but Marcus seemed determined to escalate rather than de-escalate. The man's body language suggested he was feeding off the attention and had no intention of stopping his disruptive behavior voluntarily. What particularly troubled Sergeant Mitchell was Marcus's casual dismissal of military service and tradition. The guard ceremony wasn't just pageantry for tourists. It was a living connection to centuries of British military history. The uniforms, the precision movements, the formal protocols, all of these elements presented the continuity of service that had protected Britain through its darkest hours. To mock these traditions was to mock everyone who had served, including those who had given their lives in that service as a professional soldier. The sergeant understood the difference between legitimate criticism and disrespectful behavior. People certainly had the right to disagree with monarchy or question political systems. However, there was a proper time and place for such discussions, and disrupting a ceremony that brought joy to families and visitors from around the world was not appropriate under any circumstances. Marcus seemed to be building toward an even more dramatic outburst. His phone was still recording, and he appeared to be performing for his online audience as much as addressing the people physically present. The sergeant recognized the type, someone who confused volume with validity, and attention with respect. These were often the most dangerous kind of troublemaker, because they were unpredictable and motivated by ego rather than genuine principle. The crowd was becoming increasingly restless. Some tourists were leaving the area entirely, their once-in-a-lifetime experience ruined by one man's selfish behavior. Others were beginning to argue among themselves about how to handle the situation. The peaceful, respectful atmosphere that should have characterized the ceremony was dissolving into chaos and confusion. Sergeant Mitchell made a decision. His duty was not just to perform ceremonial functions, but to protect the dignity of the institution and ensure the safety and comfort of the visitors who came to witness these ancient traditions. He had sworn an oath to serve and protect, and that oath extended beyond the royal family, to the people of Britain, and the guests who honored them with their presence. The sergeant began to move with the deliberate, measured steps that characterized his military bearing. He was not rushing or appearing aggressive, but anyone with military experience would recognize the purposeful nature of his movement. 23 years of service had taught him that sometimes situations required direct intervention. This was clearly one of those moments. As he approached the area where Marcus was continuing his tirade, Sergeant Mitchell's expression remained professionally neutral. He had dealt with difficult people in war zones and knew that calm authority was often more effective than displays of force or anger. However, those who knew him well would have recognized the steel in his gray eyes and the set of his jaw that indicated his patience was not unlimited. The confrontation that Marcus had been unconsciously provoking was about to begin, but not in the way he expected. He was about to encounter a man who embodied everything he had been dismissing: genuine service, earned respect, and quiet strength that came from facing real challenges rather than simply talking about them. Marcus was in the middle of another loud proclamation about real leadership when he noticed a tall figure in the distinctive red uniform approaching him. At first, he assumed it was just another guard going about his ceremonial duties. But as the man drew closer, something about his bearing made Marcus pause mid-sentence. Sergeant Mitchell stopped directly in front of Marcus, close enough to speak in normal tones but far enough away to maintain appropriate space. The contrast between the two men was striking. Marcus in his casual tourist clothes, phone still in hand, slightly out of breath from his animated speaking. The sergeant standing perfectly straight, hands at his sides, his presence commanding attention without saying a word. "Sir," the sergeant began, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. "I couldn't help but notice your commentary about our ceremony. Perhaps I might have a word with you." Marcus looked the sergeant up and down, taking in the perfectly pressed uniform, the military bearing, and the serious expression. For a moment, he seemed slightly taken aback by the direct approach, but quickly recovered his composure. "Oh, here we go," he said, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Let me guess. You're going to tell me I can't speak my mind? Is that how free speech works over here?" The sergeant's expression remained neutral, but those familiar with military demeanor would have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. "Not at all, sir. You're absolutely free to express your opinions. However, I thought you might be interested in hearing from someone who has actually lived the experiences you're discussing so confidently." This response seemed to catch Marcus off guard. He had expected to be told to be quiet or move along, not invited into a conversation. The crowd around them had grown silent, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Even tourists who had been moving away stopped to listen. "Look, soldier," Marcus said, his tone becoming more condescending. "I'm sure you're a nice guy just doing your job. But let's be honest here. This whole thing is just dress up in theater. Where I come from, we respect people who get real things done in the real world, not people who march around in costumes for tourists." Sergeant Mitchell nodded slowly, as if considering the words carefully. "I see. And what qualifies as real world experience in your opinion, sir?" His tone remained respectful, but there was something in his posture that suggested this was not going to be the conversation Marcus expected. "Well, for starters," Marcus replied, gaining confidence, "real leaders who make tough decisions, who fight for their people instead of just following orders. People who have actually built something, created jobs, made America great again. Not people who just inherited their positions and expect everyone to bow down to them." The sergeant listened patiently, his hands still at his sides, his expression unchanged. When Marcus finished, there was a moment of silence that seemed to stretch longer than it actually was. Several tourists had formed a loose circle around the two men, sensing they were witnessing something important. "That's an interesting perspective," the sergeant said finally. "I wonder if I might share some of my own real-world experience, since you seem to value that." His voice remained calm and professional, but there was an undertone that made several people in the crowd straighten up unconsciously. Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "Sure, go ahead. Tell me about your parades and your ceremonies, and how important it all is to keep up traditions. I've got time." Sergeant Mitchell's eyes never left Marcus's face as he began to speak. "Well, sir, before I had the honor of serving in these ceremonies, I spent 3 tours in Afghanistan. 23 years in Her Majesty's service, actually. I've had the privilege of working alongside some of your countrymen, American soldiers who, I must say, conducted themselves with honor and professionalism under the most difficult circumstances imaginable." The change in Marcus's expression was subtle but noticeable. He had not expected to be confronted by actual combat experience, and for the first time since his outburst began. He seemed slightly uncertain about his position. The sergeant continued in the same measured tone. "During my time there, I learned quite a bit about real leadership. I saw officers make life-and-death decisions that affected not just their own soldiers, but entire communities. I watched young men and women put their lives on the line not for personal glory, but because they believed in something larger than themselves." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but the sergeant's steady gaze and calm authority seemed to discourage interruption.
Oh.
The crowd around them had grown completely silent, hanging on every word. "I've been in situations where real courage was required, not the kind of courage it takes to shout at tourists during a peaceful ceremony, but the kind where your decisions determine whether your friends go home to their families or not. I've seen what genuine sacrifice looks like, and I've learned to distinguish between people who talk about strength and those who actually possess it." The sergeant paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Marcus's phone had long since stopped recording. His earlier bravado was beginning to look forced and hollow in the face of the quiet dignity standing before him. Now, Sergeant Mitchell continued, "You mentioned respect for people who have built something and created jobs. That's admirable. But I wonder if you might also consider showing respect for people who have built peace, who have created safety, whose job it is to ensure that ceremonies like this one can take place without fear of violence or hatred." The crowd around them had grown larger, but unlike during Marcus's earlier outburst, the atmosphere was one of focused attention rather than uncomfortable tension. People seemed to recognize they were witnessing something extraordinary, a masterclass in how dignity and quiet strength could diffuse hostility without aggression or harsh words. Marcus stood there, his earlier confidence visibly shaken by the sergeant's calm but powerful words. The man he had expected to dismiss as just another ceremonial figure had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of experienced professional that Marcus claimed to respect. For the first time since his outburst began, Marcus seemed to be actually listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. I support the troops," Marcus said, his voice noticeably quieter than before. "I've always supported our military. But that doesn't change the fact that this whole monarchy thing is outdated. I mean, come on, people bowing to someone just because of who their parents were. That's not the American way." Sergeant Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right that it's not the American way. No one here would expect it to be. But perhaps you might consider that different countries can have different traditions.
Yeah.
While still sharing common values like honor, service, and respect for others." The sergeant's tone remained conversational, but his words carried weight that seemed to resonate with everyone listening. "You see, sir, the ceremony you're witnessing today isn't really about one family or one person. It's about continuity. It's about the idea that some things are worth preserving across generations. These traditions connect us to our history and remind us of the sacrifices made by those who came before us." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with how to respond to such a reasonable explanation. "But surely you have to admit that some of these traditions are just, well, they're just for show. I mean, what's the practical purpose of all this marching around?" "That's a fair question," the sergeant replied. Let me answer it this way. During my time in Afghanistan, I worked with soldiers from many different countries. Americans, Canadians, Australians, Germans, brave people, all. But you know what? We all had in common, regardless of our different political systems back home. Marcus shook his head, genuinely curious now, despite himself. Discipline, the sergeant continued. The ability to work together toward a common goal, even when it's difficult or dangerous. It's the understanding that some things are bigger than our individual desires or opinions. That precision and attention to detail can mean the difference between success and failure, between life and death. He gestured slightly toward the guards, who were continuing their ceremony with professional composure, despite the ongoing conversation. Every movement you see here represents hours of practice, dedication to excellence, and commitment to something beyond oneself. These skills, the ability to follow orders precisely, to work as part of a team, to maintain standards even when no one is watching, these are exactly the qualities that make soldiers effective in combat situations. Several tourists were nodding in recognition of the sergeant's point. Marcus looked around and seemed to notice for the first time how his behavior had affected the people around him. A family with young children had moved away from the area. An elderly couple looked disappointed and sad. The Japanese tourists he had dismissed earlier were watching him with expressions that mixed disapproval with pity. "I didn't mean to ruin anyone's day," Marcus said, and for the first time sounded genuinely apologetic rather than defensive. "I just ... I believe strongly in the things I was saying." "Then that's admirable," the sergeant replied. "Conviction is important. But perhaps you might consider that there's a difference between having strong beliefs and expressing them in ways that diminish other people's experiences or disrespect their values." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing what he had heard. The crowd around them waited respectfully, sensing that something important was happening in the conversation between these two very different men. "You know," the sergeant continued, "I've met many Americans during my service, and the vast majority of them conducted themselves with grace and respect, even in difficult circumstances. They understood that representing your country well means showing courtesy to others, especially when you're a guest in their homeland." The words stung because they were delivered without malice or anger. Just a quiet observation that highlighted how far Marcus had fallen short of the standards he claimed to represent. Several American tourists in the crowd looked embarrassed, clearly feeling that Marcus's behavior reflected poorly on them as well. Marcus looked down at his phone, which was still in his hand but no longer recording. "My followers back home expect me to speak up about these things, expect me to challenge the establishment wherever I find it. And there's nothing wrong with challenging ideas," the sergeant replied. But perhaps your followers would be more impressed by seeing you engage respectfully with people who have different perspectives, rather than simply dismissing traditions you don't fully understand." The elderly British woman who had tried to defend her grandfather earlier approached the conversation cautiously. Her eyes were still damp with tears, but her expression showed curiosity rather than anger. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "thank you for explaining things so well. My grandson is serving in the Royal Marines, and I know he would be proud to hear how you represented the service today." The sergeant turned to her with obvious respect. Your grandson is carrying on a proud tradition. Please give him my regards and tell him that his service is appreciated by those of us who understand what it means." Marcus watched this exchange with growing discomfort. He was beginning to realize that his loud proclamations about strength and leadership paled in comparison to the quiet dignity and genuine respect being demonstrated by the man in uniform standing before him. The transformation in Marcus was visible to everyone watching. The loud, confrontational man who had disrupted the ceremony was gradually being replaced by someone who seemed smaller, more uncertain, and increasingly aware of how his behavior appeared to others. Sergeant Mitchell's calm professionalism had achieved what anger or force never could have. It had created space for reflection and genuine consideration. "Sergeant," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology. I owe everyone here an apology." He looked around at the crowd that had gathered, making eye contact with several of the people he had disturbed earlier. I came here with my mind already made up about what I was going to see, and I didn't show the respect that this place and these people deserved." The sergeant nodded acknowledgement of the apology, but waited to see if Marcus had more to say. It was clear that the American was struggling with something deeper than just embarrassment about his behavior. "You know what the worst part is?" Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, but maintaining the new tone of humility. "I keep talking about respect for military service, but I've never served myself. I keep talking about real leadership. But when was the last time I actually led by example instead of just shooting my mouth off?" Several people in the crowd exchanged glances. This level of self-reflection was unexpected, and it seemed genuine rather than performative. The Japanese tourist whom Marcus had dismissed earlier stepped forward slightly, his expression softening. The tourist said carefully, "Perhaps this can be a learning experience for all of us. I travel much, and I see that sometimes passion for our own beliefs can make us forget courtesy to others. But when we remember to listen, we can learn much." Marcus looked at him gratefully. "You're being kinder to me than I deserve after how I spoke to you earlier. It's real class right there." Sergeant Mitchell had been watching this exchange with approval. His years of military service had taught him to recognize genuine remorse, and Marcus's transformation appeared authentic. However, the sergeant also understood that the real test would be what happened next. "Mr. Thompson," the sergeant said, having learned the man's name from his earlier loud introductions to his phone camera, "you mentioned that you have followers who look to you for leadership. Perhaps this could be an opportunity to show them what real leadership looks like when someone makes a mistake." Marcus looked puzzled for a moment, then understanding dawned on his face. He pulled out his phone again, but this time his demeanor was completely different. Instead of the aggressive, performative energy he had displayed earlier, he now held the device with obvious reluctance. "You think I should? Tell them what really happened here today? Tell them I was wrong?" "I think," the sergeant replied carefully, "that your followers would benefit from seeing that strong people can admit their mistakes and learn from them. That might be more valuable than any political message you could send." The crowd had grown quiet again, sensing that they were witnessing the climax of an extraordinary morning. Marcus stared at his phone for a long moment, clearly wrestling with a decision that would affect how he saw himself and how others saw him. Finally, activated the camera and began to speak. His voice was steady but humble, completely different from his earlier recordings. "Folks, I need to tell you about something that just happened to me here at Windsor Castle. I came here thinking I was going to show you how to stand up to the establishment, but instead, I learned something about what real strength and leadership actually look like." He turned the camera so it could capture Sergeant Mitchell standing nearby, still maintaining his professional bearing despite the unusual circumstances. "This man right here is everything I claim to respect about military service. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and when I was making a fool of myself and disrespecting his traditions, he didn't get angry or throw me out. He treated me with more respect than I was showing anyone else, and he taught me something important." Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. The tourists around him were listening intently, many of them recording the moment on their own devices. "He taught me that you can be proud of your own country and your own beliefs without tearing down other people's traditions. That real leadership means treating people with dignity, even when they don't deserve it. And that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit when you've been wrong." The sergeant remained silent, allowing Marcus to speak without interference, but his expression showed approval of the direction the conversation was taking. "So I want to apologize," Marcus continued, "to everyone who was here trying to enjoy a beautiful ceremony and had to listen to me make it all about my political opinions. I want to apologize to the guards who served their country with honor and had to watch me mock their service. I want to apologize to my fellow Americans because I know I didn't represent our country well today." When Marcus finished recording and put his phone away, the crowd remained quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, scattered applause began to build. It started with the elderly British woman whose grandfather had served in the Guards, gradually spread through the crowd. It wasn't the kind of enthusiastic applause reserved for entertainment, but rather the respectful recognition that people give when they witness genuine courage and growth. "Sergeant." Mitchell stepped forward and extended his hand to Marcus. Mr. Thompson, it takes real strength to do what you just did. Your countrymen should be proud of you." As they shook hands, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the quiet satisfaction that comes from doing the right thing. Not because it serves your interests, but because it's simply right. The ceremony continued around them, and for the first time that day, Marcus watched it with genuine appreciation for the skill, tradition, and dignity it represented. The morning that had begun with conflict and disrespect had ended with understanding and mutual respect. The ancient stones of Windsor Castle had witnessed another moment that proved the enduring power of civility, courage, and the willingness to admit when we've been wrong.